Dobrý den, moc děkujeme za pozdraví a omlouváme se, že budeme mluvit anglicky. So without further ado, now it's working okay. Let's go on a short imaginary trip to North Tyrol, which is situated in Western Austria. And let's take a look at it during the second millennium BC, mostly. What do you need to know about North Tyrol before we can start? Well, it is located in the Eastern Alps, so the topography is dominated by the mountains, the valleys, of course, inside the mountains, and most important is the in-river valley, which you can see here. Here are a few impressions about the landscape that you can find there. Here you have a view of Tyrol's capital, Innsbruck, and the mountain range Nordkette behind it. This is one of the typical side valleys with Lake Aachen in the background. And this is a view of the Tyrolean lowlands, the so-called lowlands, where the valleys broaden up a bit more than in the uplands. And the nowadays climate is temperate, similar to what you are used to here, with a lot of snow in the winter, at least usually, and this would be a typical view of the summer. The time we are talking about is the Bronze Age, so that ranges in North Tyrol from about 2200 until 800 BC, though Steve and I will focus on the early and middle Bronze Age, so we are talking of the 23rd to 14th century BC. What you should keep in mind when we are talking about prehistoric North Tyrol are some natural resources that are very important from this region. These are, on the one hand, siliceous rock deposits. Marked with the circles are the ones that are in Tyrol and a little bit to the west, which are, on the one hand, rock crystal in yellow, and in greenish, the radiolarian rocks that are a variant of silex. We also have rock salt, but this will not be a focus of our talk today. And of course, most importantly, maybe in the Bronze Age, are the copper ore deposits, both of the Pfahl ore and the chalcopyrite variant. And so another word on the prehistoric copper mining. In North Tyrol, we have the mining district of Schwarzbrixleg as well as of Kitzbühel. And these in yellow are the ones from Salzburg, namely the Mitterberg district, which you probably know. And the time frame is interesting insofar as it starts in the early Bronze Age in Tyrol, but that is terminated during the Middle Bronze Age and only resumed later in the Late Bronze Age again. And during this hiatus, the Mitterberg gains the dominance over the copper production, and on a very small scale, also the Kitzbühel region. As a summary on what was known or most commonly published about early bronze metallurgy and early copper mining in Tyrol, this is the status quo from about 10 years ago. We had knowledge of two late Neolithic or maybe Copper Age sites from Tyrol, the Kirchelberg and the Mariahilfbergel, which are nothing more than an experimental phase with metallurgy of the local ores. And then a bit more we have from the early Bronze Age, though the most important sites are or have been the Buchberg and the Tischhofer Cave, and the other finds were on a very small scale. And what we also had were 3 pollen profiles, whereby geochemical indicators we also knew that early Bronze Age mining had to happen in the vicinity. And now I would like to go into detail regarding my PhD project. The main research question I'm following up on is how are settlement and copper supply interrelated in the Bronze Age in North Tyrol? And a few aspects I would like to talk about here in more detail. One question I'm wondering about is whether there was a colonization of Tyrol for copper ore exploitation, if there were any changes in settlement patterns or land use depending on the mining and metallurgical activities. And I would like to gain an estimation of the socio-economic importance of mining and metallurgical activities. There are a few other things that, of course, play a role in my PhD, but that will be of no importance here. So, to start with the first question. It would seem rather straightforward to look what do we have from the archaeological record for the Bronze Age in Tyrol. We have about 250 sites, though this, of course, also includes stray finds, so you have to see that a bit relatively. And now it would seem rather easy to say, well, let's look at the chronological development and then you have your answer. Well, it's not as easy as that. If we take a look at this, it seems that the narrative is rather straightforward. In the late Neolithic, we only have a very scarce number of archaeological sites known from Tyrol, and it would seem that there happened a migration coming from the Bavarian lowlands up the Inn River. Then a few more settlements during the early Bronze Age. Then settlement activity spreads also to the Tyrolean uplands in the Middle Bronze Age, as well as to other side valleys. And then there is a huge densification in the late Bronze Age. However, I was a bit skeptical, especially if you look at the late Bronze Age, because you can see here's this big concentration around Innsbruck. That is no wonder, of course. It is the location of the three major research institutions, which are the Federal Monuments Office, the Tyrolean State Museum, and of course the Archaeological Institute from Innsbruck. And we have huge other parts of the country where we have no sites at all, even if we know there are these large cemeteries of the late Bronze Age with hundreds of buried people. So our expectation was there should have been more settlements. So we also should take into account there is this mountainous region, and we have a lot of natural forces with the potential to massively change the landscape and, yeah, to have an effect on archaeological preservation. Especially rock slides are important here to note, because we know of two events of rock slides in the Bronze Age that really covered up the whole Inn Valley. And there was afterwards a big flooding, and then later on the Inn River worked through the landslide. And so we have to assume that there were big changes and also big changes in the archaeological record. And so I thought there must be some way to gain a new perspective on human activities in the past. And we are very lucky in one regard. In Tyrol, we have more than 50 pollen profiles that were analyzed for Tyrol, and quite a few of them show anthropogenic indicators. And so we have here, for example, the palynological record as well as the archaeological record for the Neolithic period. You see, we only have these three sites, but about 30 pollen profiles in very different regions than the archaeological record shows, where humans apparently settled and did other stuff like agriculture as well. The same goes for the Bronze Age. Of course, the archaeological record for this period is much better than for the Neolithic, but still we see that the pollen profiles are able to show that there was human activity also in regions that the archaeological sites still don't cover. So I think we can see that Bronze Age Tyrol did not get settled in the second millennium BC, but already earlier. And so let's... Hi, Gerhard. He's our PhD supervisor, that's okay. So let's take a brief look at the settlement development in Tyrol before the Neolithic even, because yes, of course, there are a few sites, and with sites, I mean more than just single finds, but these are really sites that showed features from the Mesolithic and even one from the Paleolithic. But most interestingly are three pollen profiles that actually show agricultural activities for the Middle to Late Mesolithic already. So this is not just some seasonal hunting activity or stuff like that, but there are settlements starting during the Mesolithic. So I think to answer the question if there was a colonization of North Tyrol during the Bronze Age for the copper ore exploitation, we can really answer no, that starts much, much earlier, this process. here we have a view into the Paleolithic sites that I mentioned before from around 35,000 BC and also containing later a Bronze Age use phase. We see the seasonal land use began already during the last ice age, as is shown by this cave, and continued then onwards through all periods. We have the first permanent settlements probably from the Neolithic onwards, and also already during this period, the first indicators for agricultural land use of the alpine zones. Most interestingly is also that if we look at this graph that shows the settlement activity development through time as it was gained from pollen profiles, and here below some climate indicators that you can ignore for now, then we can see that we have a settlement activity peak in the Middle Bronze Age, which is extremely curious because we know that this is also a time of a climate deterioration. And so one can wonder about the interpretation of these findings, whether this actually means a settlement densification or if it maybe is a reaction because of the climate fluctuations that bigger settlements spread out into several smaller ones, which would also show, of course, an increase in settlement activity, but means something else than general more inhabitants, for example. Anyway, it's worth noting that there is this settlement activity peak during the Middle Bronze Age, although we have these climate fluctuations. And if you remember, there is the hiatus of the mining activity. So a huge economic sector falls away. And then coming back to the original question, was there some colonization in connection with the copper ore exploitation? Well, yes, there are some indicators for that from the graveyard folders, but this is for the late Bronze Age only. And this is all we have in this regard for now. So some insights into the next question. What about changes in settlement patterns and land use? We have a new research cooperation going on with the colleagues Lisa S. and Peter Trebsche from the Archaeological Institute and Hugo Bisson and Laurent Marquet from the Botanical Institute. And we are working on detecting human influence on the landscapes during the Metal Ages, so roughly the last 2.5 millennia before Christ. This is our database, so a little less than 200 archaeological sites for the Metal Ages, as well as 18 pollen profiles. What we had to do first to work together was actually making our data comparable. For this, we used the approach of time slides. So our archaeological chronology was split up into 12 time slides, each 200 years. It works more or less. Of course, you can see we had to do some tricks, but more or less it works like this. And this facilitates the comparison with the paleobotanical data. What the paleobotanists do is they know that pollen grains have different sizes, different weights, and thus they fly different distances. And also the plant species produce different amounts of pollen. So in a pollen profile, the sample shows different amounts of the species that don't correlate directly to the real vegetation in the surrounding. So you need an algorithm to correct this relativity. So here we see the diagram. This would be the original amount of pollen grains in the sample, and the left is the corrected version about the plant abundance estimates. After they use this algorithm, they can put together the results from all the pollen profiles that we have from the region, in this case 18, and calculate regional vegetation estimates. This would look, in this case, once again, here the plant abundance on the left, and this is an interpreted diagram showing that we have mostly an evergreen forest in North Tyrol, or in the North Tyrolean lowlands, I should say, a bit deciduous forest, shrubs you can only imagine here between the yellowish and the greenish part of the diagram. These are the shrubs. a bit open land, but not too much. And here on the far right, you can see the agricultural indicators. And then you can go one step further, and from the regional vegetation estimates go down to the local vegetation estimates, which works with the leave one out approach. So you take the regional results and basically subtract the one sample that you are most interested in, and the difference then shows you what actually has to be the local vegetation in contrast to the regional vegetation. And so I was most interested in this one, the site Kogelmoor, which I will show you in the following, because a rather prominent early Bronze Age site, the Buchberg, is located quite close. And I was hoping to see the human impact from the early Bronze Age in this pollen profile. However, it didn't quite work out as is expected. You can see that at the Kogelmoor, we have mainly forest, and even during the early Bronze Age, there is a slight change, but not much. And of course, if we take a closer look at the location, we understand why. Because local vegetation really means we have to take into account what the algorithm calculates, what the source area for the pollen profile was at different times. And oops, you can see here in the circle in yellow indicates the minimum source area, and in green, the bigger circle indicates the maximum of the source area for the local vegetation. So of course, the archaeological site that I was interested in, this is 4 kilometers in this direction, of course, is too far away already to be shown there. And we can also see here is quite a bit going on in regards to late Bronze Age and early Iron Age mining. This isn't shown here in the pollen profile, most likely because of the topography. This is in another side valley, and the human impact that certainly was detectable here simply isn't detectable beyond the mountain range. Another example where you can clearly see the human impact, however, is the Schwarzenberg Moor, where we here in the late Bronze Age definitely see the human impact. And this is no wonder. We have mining going on all around, both in the early as well as in the late Bronze Age, and some in the early Iron Age as well. And especially this late Bronze Age mining that is located directly adjacent to the site is probably shown here. So it works. It was just really important for us to know. And very interesting for us is actually Lake Seefeld, because as you can see in the map, there are no archaeological sites known in the surroundings, but the local vegetation estimates clearly show this huge peak for agriculture from the Middle Bronze Age onwards. So we have to assume that there was a settlement very close by, and this definitely is an area where we have to go looking as archaeologists now. So to answer the questions here, first we have to say this approach was really good for us to make the palynological and the archaeological data directly comparable with each other. Although we have, of course, to say that this statistical approach oversimplifies the archaeological data. For example, we don't know actually that much Middle Bronze Age sites from North Tyrol. This is simply if we have sites that only date to the Bronze Age, statistics mean we add it up to early, middle, and late Bronze Age. So this is a problem we have to take into account. Vegetation changes are detectable, yes, but only at the local scale at the moment, as it would seem. They are partially corresponding with mining and metallurgical activities, but probably not as far-reaching as we would have expected before the study. And on the regional level, which I show again here on the left, we have only a moderate land opening that is recognizable. So I think this really helps to reset our archaeological expectations, because we tend to overestimate human impact at some time and underestimate it at others. So this really helps to correct this. And now to the last question I want to present here. How about the socio-economic importance of mining and metallurgy? In the beginning of my PhD, I wondered if it's possible to gain the total amount of copper ore that was mined during the Bronze Age in Tyrol, or at least during the early Bronze Age. However, we have the problem that The old mining, of course, is superimposed by modern mining. So we lose a lot of these. The prehistoric mining traces often cannot be dated, or at least not in high resolution, because, for example, here we see these typical fire set mining pits, but we only know they are prehistoric. We don't know anything more. We also don't know whether there were ore outcrops on the surface and if they were used. And we also don't know the exact ore content of the rock that was mined. So at the moment, at least, we can determine the amount of copper ore that was mined in the Bronze Age. Then I thought, well, if it's not possible with the ore, maybe it's at least possible to say how much copper was actually produced in North Tyrol. Well, from the finds itself, we know only a minimum of what once existed is known to us today. So this really brings a lot of gaps in preservation, discovery, and investigation for us. The classical Ösenring copper, as it is called, you can see them here, is of course a huge amount of finds that gets linked to the North Tyrolean ore deposits, but actually there were only few impurity pattern and lead isotope studies to say that reliably. Of course, we have these moving metals articles, you probably are familiar with them, that show that the North Tyrolean copper was in some cases exchanged up until Sweden, which is impressive, but we can't say for this whole group of classical Ösenring copper that it belongs to the North Tyrolean ore deposits. We once again have the problem with the dating. Even if we can link certain groups of metal artifacts to the Tyrolean deposits, we don't know, was it a short, very intensive production phase, or was it a very long production on a very small scale? And so in principle, we can say we have difficulties with such a classical economic approach because there are too many parameters that we simply can't know at the moment. However, that isn't to say that economic theory can't provide some insights. And it was Stephen Shannon who published an article about Ricardo's law of comparative advantage and said, or brought into memory, that regions specialize because that is better than producing something that other regions can produce more cheaper. And so he said, well, this is really interesting for us if we consider that North Tyrol stopped mining in the Middle Bronze Age, which is the main operating phase for the Mitterberg mining in the Salzburg region, which are neighbors. And of course, the differences in the costs of production are based on technical improvements or when there is a high demand on economies of scale. And since we know that the Pfahl ore copper from North Tyrol was processed in a much different way than the chalcopyrite copper from Mitterberg, this probably fits quite well to say there were technological differences, and that meant one of the producers gained a comparative advantage over the other. And also worth noting is that the specialization in production of the regions is to the benefit of all, and everybody profits, though not all profit equally from it. But there is an overall economic growth, which would fit well together with the settlement activity peak that we have in the Middle Bronze Age, even though there is no more mining in North Tyrol. And then Gerhard Tomedi and Ulrike Töchterle brought this idea further and developed the thesis that if in the Middle Bronze Age in North Tyrol there was this hiatus in mining, as well as the phase of climate deterioration, but we have this peak of settlement activity, then this probably meant that they developed a more resilient agropastoral system and that they probably specialized, once again, thinking of Shannon, that they specialized in the surplus production of agricultural products, maybe even to support mining regions, because we know that the Mitterberg, as well as other mining regions, are dependent on food supply from outwards, for example. But even though this whole complex makes for a nice and convincing hypothesis, it got me thinking whether we should really only think about economics in this strict sense, or if it may be worth to think about general influences on conscious decision-making. Because yes, there are obvious needs and restraints that societies take into account and which may have led to the termination of the mining, but also the perception of the environment probably plays a role, as well as social values and norms, which can change over time. And maybe they simply thought that mining was too dangerous and said, let's leave it to the Salzburg people and we will do agriculture. Who knows? Anyway, I thought might be worth to take a closer look into it. And so the focus shifted a bit to socio-economics and especially value concepts. The readings that were most important for me were Mary Douglas, Michael Thompson, and Greta Zieves. And I will go only very shortly into this. I derived 4 hypotheses from it, that we can generally derive a value attribution by the way past societies handled matter and how they behaved, that we will find as archaeologists the majority of things where they were allowed to be according to the order system of the past society, that value concepts are always context bound, which is for archaeologists rather helpful because we are used to work with different contexts of our finds anyway. And we have the thesis that value concepts are dynamic. And I would like to go a little bit more into this. We can derive from sociological studies like consumer choice behavior value categories. For example, we like objects because they are practical, or because they mark us as members of a social group, or because they evoke feelings in us, or because they quench our thirst for novelty, or because we use them under a very specific set of conditions. Of course, on the whole range of values, there's also negative value and neutral value probably. So there are also waste categories, but they are also with different value ascriptions possible. We have material that is still somewhat usable, like recyclables. We have something that is in a condition worthy of disposal, but that is so important or symbolic to us that we can treat it like regular trash. There are things that aren't really trash, but that we don't think are useful either, like a gift from the in-laws that we could have easily lived without. There is trash that we don't even think about and that we treat in an unregulated way. And there is refuse where we think it's unhygienic or it's dangerous, that we really try to avoid further confrontation with. And then if we think about the last thesis that values are always dynamic and can change, then we see that it's possible that they change from one position to the other. Archaeologists, for example, are really good at changing the values of objects, something that was disposed of as trash from past societies that we find and give lasting value under the label of cultural heritage items. So this would be an example how during the biography of an object, values can change. And now, finally, after this theoretical introduction, an example from Bronze Age Tyrol. We are talking about slag-tempered pottery. This really means, yes, we are talking about vessels that contain slag particles in the matrix. They are in different sizes from cent grains up to sometimes more than 1 centimeter. They are found in domestic pottery, technical ceramics, as well as in funerary vessels. And so far, this seems to be a phenomenon that is only existent in the Bronze and early Iron Age in the Tyrolean and Salzburg region, as you can see here on the map. So if we take these theoretical considerations about value systems, what can that tell us about the mentality of Bronze Age population? First, we need to know slag is a leftover from the smelting process, and because it still contains small amounts of copper, people crushed it, ground it, and wet mechanically processed it to extract the copper it still contained. So the slag that is then left over is definitely a waste material because there is no more copper inside. So they were usually just left around in the landscape, but in some cases, apparently a valorization took place that people recycled it and used it for pottery production. And so there were a few theses so far about why people add slag particles to pottery. The first is functional based. The particles are sharp-edged, which is helpful in producing the pottery. They are heat resistant, so they don't change their properties anymore when the pottery is fired. And it may even lend a better heat conduction or an antibacterial effect to the pottery. The next hypothesis is conditional. They say at smelting sites, the slag particles are already available. And what is helpful for the potters, it's already uniform sized. And there is the hypothesis it may have social or emotional reasons, like, for example, some superstitious ideas, what it may do with the pottery, or that it may be used even as the identity marker of a mining society. But if we think about how realistic they are, the first two, okay, they are helpful for pottery production no matter what. But if the thesis were true that there is better heat conduction or some other effect that works with the pottery in everyday use, then it would be strange to find it also in funerary vessels. If it's only used in the pottery production that happens at smelting sites, yes, that can happen. Strange, again, that we would find it in the funerary pottery, because the graveyards usually are on the bottoms of the valleys, whereas the smelting sites are on the mountain slopes. So it would be strange that we find pottery that apparently was produced on the mountain slopes down in the valleys. But okay, it may be possible. However, what is strange and what really speaks against the conditional thesis is that we have pottery where the slag particles still contain copper, which speaks against this reprocessing for gaining the copper it still contained. And it's sometimes in very inhomogeneous sizes, which again speaks against being processed in a systematic way, like you would expect it if they do it first to gain the copper inside. So this thesis is probably not all that realistic. And for the last one, we have to say the slag particles are sometimes very, very small. So you can really argue if it's helpful as an identity marker if people usually can't even see it. So this may be more important for the funerary wear, where the people that deposited the vessels know it contains slag particles, but they don't need to see it anymore. Anyway, we gain with this theoretical approach insight and new direction for further research questions or research strategies. We can say, well, if it would be one of the first two reasons, we should find it mostly in large vessels because there it's most helpful. If it's the second of the functional reasons, then we first have to say we need experiments that could first prove if there is actually such an effect. And then we would expect to find it mostly in cooking or storage vessels or in technical pottery. The conditional one, I think we can exclude anyway, but we would definitely need provenance research and the comparison between different potteries to argue for that. And in the last, we can say we have to further look for the perceptibility of the slag particles. And interesting might also be if grave goods that contain this slag-tempered pottery also contain other grave goods connected with mining or metallurgical activities, which would more argue towards this identity marking system. So to sum up, as if I were hard-pressed to answer the research questions very shortly, I would say, is there a colonization for copper ore exploitation? No, there was not. In North Tyrol, we see it started way, way earlier, and we have only a small indication for migration that has to do with mining activities, and it's only in the late Bronze Age. However, lessons learned from this research question, we have massive limitations of the archaeological record, and the pollen profiles are a very important source for any archaeological research as well. The short answer for the question, are there any changes in settlement patterns and land use? yes, I think we were able to show that with the botanical colleagues. However, we see that the impact of metal production and settlement activity during the Bronze Age overall was only moderate. However, we see these changes on the local level very clearly. And I think we also see that this methodological approach has great potential regarding further site detection as well as the interpretation, both from the botanical as well as the archaeological perspective. And for the last question, of course, mining and metallurgy were important for the Bronze Age society in North Tyrol, but probably less than animal husbandry, as we have seen with the economic development during the Middle Bronze Age especially. We have to simply admit that the classical economic approach for North Tyrol fails. We can gain no hard numbers so far, but still economic and sociological theories prove helpful, if only to develop new direction for research questions. And so we should still follow up on that. And now, if there are no direct questions that we should answer directly, then I would give over to Steve. Okay.
So I think we can maybe leave the questions after the second part of the presentation. So please go on.
So in this case, welcome from my side. And after Jessica gave us such a nice introduction in the Bronze Age of North Tyrol, I want to focus a little bit more on the Middle Bronze Age. And since we heard the archaeological sources are a little bit, let's call it sparse for this time period, I want to focus on the Middle Bronze Age hoard from the Pillar Moosbruckshofen. And it's won't be a hyper-detailed case study, don't worry. I want to give more of a broad overview and then show you what we can learn from a study of one hoard find and how it can broaden our understanding from a certain area. Before we start, I want to repeat the most basic points regarding North Tyrol in the Bronze Age, since it gets important later on. As Jessica told us, the settlement of North Tyrol began in the early Neolithic period, and we have an early experimental phase regarding metallurgical activities. Also then, but then significant intensification of the smelting of fall ores is not confirmed until the early Bronze Age. The settlements, as we heard, are concentrated in this period. In this period in the lower Inn Valley. And at the end of the late Bronze Age, we have a few changes. The Phallar copper gets less important, and the Chalcopyrite copper from the Mitterberg regions almost takes over all of the production until it's completely dominant in the Middle Bronze Age. And then we have a shift in the settlement activities from the lower Inn Valley also to the more important, let's call it trade routes or routes across the Alps, regarding over the Brenner Pass and also the upper Inn Valley here. In the early and Middle Bronze Age, Tyrol did not develop any distinct cultural manifestations. This means weapons, tools, and jewelry, and also pottery, follow the traditions of the surrounding regions. The early and Middle Bronze Age graves in North Tyrol have so far yielded only sparse findings. The burials contain almost no grave goods and thus are even more challenging to identify. Prestige goods are not found in the graves, but instead in hoard finds, like here an example of the deposition from reed in the upper Inn Valley. In these, the former owners remain somewhat anonymous. It's only in the late Bronze Age that the presence of elites, as we may call them, in burials is evident through grave goods in the Inn Valley. And now on to the main topic. The hoard find was found at the pass crossing of the so-called Pillarhöhe in the modern village of Flies. The pass lies at an important intersection of various routes through the Alps. We have here a north-south route over the Fern and Reschen Pass to northern Italy, or also into the Swiss Engadine. We have an east-west route over the Arlberg Pass into the Alpine Rhine Valley, and eastern route to shorten the distance to the lower Inn Valley or the Brenner Pass. For the significance of, especially for the north-south route, speaks also that the Roman road Via Claudia Augusta, which connected the Alpine foreland to northern Italy, runs directly through this area. There are also numerous other archaeological sites known from the surrounding area. These include Brandopferplatz, so a site for burnt offering, only 1 kilometer away from the finding place of the hoard. We have a few settlement activities in the area, and also the also mentioned deposition from Ried here. We have also a later Hallstatt period hoard directly from the town center of Fliers. And now onto the hoard itself. The hoard was located in early May 2001 by a local metal detectorist, Franz Maurer, who works closely with the Institute of Archaeology in Innsbruck. The hoard was discovered in pretty steep terrain under a large rock boulder here, and you can see here the terrain. The hoard would be around here. During the excavations, the colleagues were faced with numerous challenges. For example, at first they only saw these objects and thought, yeah, well, a hoard around 20 objects. But as it turned out, it were more than 375 objects. Originally, the objects were contained in a ceramic vessel and surrounded with multiple stone slabs in a scale-like manner. It was covered with a bigger stone slab, but this slab began to slip at some time and crushed the vessel, spilling the objects and containing them in the rock crevice. So a block excavation was no longer possible. So each piece was, before removal, numbered and documented, so the position inside the hoard could be reconstructed at any possible moment. As I said, the hoard contained around 375 objects, including one fragment of a helmet. Here, the original folded piece, and here, the reconstruction. But also numerous fragments of swords, spears, and daggers, a lot of axes and sickles, but also jewelry pieces, casting blanks, and casting cakes. As I mentioned earlier, weapons and tools and jewelry follow the traditions of the surrounding regions. We can visualize that in my example, also with the distribution map of the axes. Here, for example, 3 axe types with distribution centers in Eastern Switzerland or Western Switzerland, in southern Germany, and also a bit further to the east, and here also in the Czech Republic. Interestingly, we have almost no influence from northern Italy at this time. And chronology, well, since I talk about the Middle Bronze Age, I think you already can guess that it's Middle Bronze Age, but I want to get a little more into detail because it gets important further on. The oldest pieces are this winged needle, this sword of the type Spatzenhausen, and this axe from the type Cressier. They all date to the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, so around 1550 BC. The youngest object that can pretty certainly dated is the Achtkantschwert of the type Hausmoning. It's typical for Bronze Age C2. But since the decoration of the hilt is pretty used, we can assume that probably it was used until the early late Bronze Age. All the other pieces fit into this time frame with only a few axes and sickles. There is a possibility that they date into the late Bronze Age, but it's not necessary. One of the most remarkable aspects of the hoard is the exceptionally good conditions of preservation. Some are still showing the original surface and only slightly patination. Corrosion is only found on the objects that were directly exposed to the soil. But in these conditions, also organic materials remained, like a few leather fragments, a wooden shaft of a spear tip, and the wood analysis suggests it is ash. Also organic remains of a sword hilt. Sometimes even a whole necklace was preserved with the leather still holding everything in place. The good and relative uniform conditions of the objects, including their patination, suggests that the older objects were carefully stored and even maintained during this storage. Otherwise, it is unlikely that the items would still show a blank surface and would show varying degrees of patination or even corrosion. In addition to the good state of preservation, it's also notable that these objects, as so often in depositional contexts, are fragmented. Particularly severely bent specimen and specific fracture patterns and regularities, as well as pronounced signs of hacking and destruction, suggest that the objects were intentionally rendered useless. A great example for patterns in destructions are the winged needles. They are always parted at the same points, bent or broken, into 6 equally large sections. There is no whole needle, but through this we can reconstruct them. Further evidence of intentional destruction is found from the bent swords, such as here. This is an example with almost 180-degree bending. And also with, for example, the axis, which is also bent and almost have chopping marks here at the wings. Also, as with other Bronze Age hoards, only a few matching fragments were placed in the deposition. For example, among the 58 axes, only 8 matching fragments were found, which can be reconstructed to 4 complete axes. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, we can reconstruct the stratigraphy of the deposition. It was done through a Harris matrix, but that wouldn't fit on this slide. So I have here instead the stratigraphy as it presented it to the excavators. There was no chronological structure or whatever visible, but objects that belong together were deposited together. The best example would be this sickle, where the two parts, the two fragments were lying next to each other, or also this necklace. But ultimately, the most important criteria for the placing in the ceramic vessel was probably the best use of the space. From this, we can also gather that the deposition was that it was a one-time action and it did not take place over a longer time. So, from the found artifact, it's possible to distinguish 3 or 4 female and 3 male equipments for leading individuals or individuals of a high social standing. It is based on the jewelry components and elements of attire, such as the winged needles, a collier of spiral tubes and spike discs, as well as spectacle pendants for the female sphere, and for example, the swords and the helmet for the male individuals. This so-called first-tier equipment for people of the highest social rank may be followed by a second tier, indicated particularly by the spearheads, especially since swords and spearheads are rarely found together in Middle Bronze Age graves. Here on this slide, a representation of the temporal distribution of the status-defining goods. And the functional assignments of the multipurpose tool X to this theory proves challenging, but it could have been supplemented weapons or represented tools or even served as ritual instruments. Similarly, the sickles might have been utilized as tools. However, Lotta Sperber suggests regarding sickles in wealthy late Bronze Age warrior graves that they might represent lord of the estates who could equip their people with such tools. These items might also have served as ritual offerings or represented some form of pre-monetary value. The casting cakes must be considered as material assets or capital. So to sum it up, the components of the deposition can be categorized as follows. Attire for female and male individuals of a social important or first rank. Spearheads and or axes for warriors of a second rank. And axes and sickles as tools, or together with casting cakes as material values or offerings. Now to gain further information from this hoard, in my PhD thesis, I applied a method of metalware analysis to these objects. Maybe just real quick, if some of you are not familiar with the term, it's pretty self-explanatory. Metalware analysis used the wear analysis of metal objects has established itself as a method mainly in the last 2 decades. The investigations are usually conducted using a microscope, focusing on specific traces on the surface of objects. This is particularly true for weapons such as swords and spear tips, but also for other objects like daggers or axes. Where blades and edges play an important part. Crucial for this method is also the experiments with authentic as possible replicas of original objects. Because if we compare the traces on the originals with those from experiments, we can interpret them. So far, only 28 of the 375 brass objects in these collections have undergone this study. And firstly, to evaluate the possibilities and possible benefits of this kind of study. Selected were a sword, a dagger, spear tips, axes, and sickles, several items of jewelry. As expected, due to the excellent state of preservation, a rich variety of traces was observable. In fact, all examined objects show signs of use, except the jewelry, where identifying specific traces of wear were predictably challenging. Some of the traces were visible even without the microscopic examinations, such as the worn sword decorations you can already see here, with only a few faintly visible lines. It also showed us that almost all parts or all objects, beside the jewelry, show specific traces of use. For example, we have here a part of a sword blade showing various dents. Also, these were affected by corrosion. We have also signs of polishing and further finer polishing towards the edge. Interesting is that the X-ray analysis of the sword shows us major casting flaws at the blade, but despite these casting flaws, it seems to have used. Traces of use are also visible on the spear tips. Here, a particularly good visible dent and also damage to the spear tip. At the axis, we can see blunted edges and also more badly damaged X blade through use. Now we can draw our first results, and the first one would be the question about the local bronze craftsmanship. Several indications of a local bronze industry can be found both within the hoard and the surrounding area. Firstly, the hoard contains 2 casting blanks and multiple casting cakes. Furthermore, the presence of 10 identical sickles within the hoard at the Moosbruck-Schrofen leads Christoph Jahn to conclude that the local production of sickles took place, as identically cast sickles are generally only found within the same site or at most in short distance from each other. Here at the pictures would be the 10 identically cast sickles. Also, there are numerous other traces of metalworking in the surrounding area. And a bit more speculative, but potentially another indication for local productions are the axes in the hoard. There is a form of axes that closely resembles two types of axes found in Switzerland and Eastern and Southern France. One argument for a local production is that this type of axes are closely related to these two types, but differ in some very important aspects. Another is the distribution maps of the mentioned types. While Fierce is located just at the edge of the distribution area of one type, the other avoids the Alpine regions completely. In addition, the axes of the same form as the ones from the part of the pillar Moosbruck-Schrofen appear only in North Tyrol and adjacent regions. Now, taking all these points in consideration, there's a strong evidence that there were a local production of bronze objects, likely also including axes and sickles in the surrounding of the hoard. While the copper for this was sourced from the Mitterberg in Salzburg, some 250 kilometers away. Now, in relation to the hoard of the Moosbruck-Schrofen, Gerhard Tomedi proposes the theory that this deposition allows us to draw conclusions about the social structure during the Middle Bronze Age, at least for this region. He particularly bases his arguments on the following points. First, the time span covered by the objects of the hoard combined with their good and uniform state of preservation suggests that at least some of the items were preserved and cared for over several generations. Secondly, the fact that burials in North Tyrol, so far as known at this time, are largely without grave goods. And third, we can see that the objects that end up in rich graves north of the Alps are here represented in hoards. And finally, fourth, the objects were intentionally fragmented, but related items were placed together in the ceramic vessel. Given the low population density in the Inn Valley during the early and Middle Bronze Age, it's likely that the main settlement cells were probably extended farmsteads or clan-like communities. These points essentially form the basis for Tomedi's theory of viewing the hoard as the possession of a local community and seeing behind its deposition a segmented, yet distinctly structured hierarchical society. In a segmentary ranked society, like here, in which the lineage as a whole stands above all else, it's quite conceivable that these objects that once served as status indicators for leading members of the lineage were returned to the general ownership after their death, and then were preserved and still taken care of. The fact that the hoard includes both male and female equipments leads Tomedi to speculate that both genders held similarly significant positions in the respective societies. From this perspective, the profane, such as the presentation of great ancestors, is of course closely linked to the sacred, as the large portions of the artifacts in the pillar deposition are likely to represent scenic and functional votive offerings, and this would also explain the great number of axes and sickles inside the hoard. So now, to sum it all up, what did we learn from the hoard? First, we have another example for the importance of this route through the Alps. We can also see the strong influences from neighboring regions, likely a result because of the important routes. We have evidence of a local bronze craftsmanship. So not all of the goods have to be imports, and we gained insights into the possible social system of the Middle Bronze Age, at least for this region. And lastly, we can conclude there were very stable structures throughout the Middle Bronze Age, since we have this collection spanning over 200 to 300 years and only ending at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. And we have also, for the whole time, a stable trade with the Mitterberg in Salzburg for the bronze, the copper at least. And with that, I'm finished. I thank you all for your attention, and now I'm open for questions.